Hello, everybody. Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning, Reverend Wilson. I'm honored to be here, and I want to just start really quickly by thanking CFED for opening up this space. I'm Dave Snyder. I'm the coordinator of the Minnesota Asset Building Coalition, and honored to be serving as the chair of the Assets and Opportunity Network. And I really am thrilled to be here. Asset building, fellow asset builders, if asset building is about looking with fierce hope into the future, I think that the charge for all of us as asset builders coming out of this conference and all the work that's been emerging lately is to be grounded in past, present, and future. That real asset building work is grounded in deep reciprocal relationships in the present and informed by the history of what's come before us and how our history impacts our present day. Doing this work around racial justice is part of being able to be fully in the present and grounded in the history of what's come before. So that's why I think this conversation is so important, and I'm glad to have it with you here this morning, Reverend Wilson.
Glad to be here with you, David. Thank you.
So I'm wondering if we could just start, if you could talk a little bit about the Ferguson Commission and how it works.
Sure. In November of 2014, Governor Jeremiah Nixon convened, and actually he made the call in October for members of the community who would be interested in participating in a commission to help the community move forward, to be stronger, be more inclusive, to be a fairer region following the events of August 9, 2014. In an open process, more than 300 people applied to be a part of the commission, and ultimately on November 18th, 16 commissioners were seated, sent forth with a charge through Executive Order 1415 to study any number of social factors. So broad social factors from housing to transportation to economics to community stability to education to even family economic stability, to put together a set of policy recommendations to help the region reach toward being a fairer, stronger, more inclusive region. It's important to note that the work was regional. It considered the entire metropolitan area, not just the city of Ferguson itself. Because the city of Ferguson itself has just about under 30,000 citizens. When we're talking about a region of St. Louis, we're talking about 2.8 million. And that also meant we had to navigate the various municipalities that are part of the region as well. So we went about our work seeking to address those issues and really, quite frankly, being thoughtful to try to use the commission as an organizing tool to amplify the best teaching and learning that was out there from the scholarship in academia to the work that's happening by organizers, community advocates, and leaders like Tashar and others on the ground. And so in the end, we feel pleased that we were able to produce and to present to the community a report that has more than 189 policy recommendations, which can be found, shameless plug, at forwardthroughferguson.org. And we did place it there at forwardthroughferguson.org because we recognize that we were not the first, or as our dear sister has said, nor would we be the last community to find itself in the place where we found ourselves. And so it's helpful for us to know that it's accessible and available to the entire nation and to the globe as we try to work through some of these issues that have visited other cities.
Would you talk a little bit more, you talked about using the commission as an organizing tool. Would you talk a little bit more about what that looked like?
Yeah, first it's important to note that I'm a nerd.
You're in good company.
I'm particularly a political science nerd. And so one of the things that I did early was studied riot commissions. I'm continuing to study truth and reconciliation commissions because I think both of them have learning for us in these moments. Lindsay Lupo, a scholar on riot commissions, she wrote a book that gave me great comfort, of course, when I realized the title. The title of her book, the definitive work on riot commissions, was Flack Catchers, 100 Years of Riot Commission Politics in America. And she noted that riot commissions have several things. Number one, they're normally used to make executives look like they're doing something when they really don't want to do anything. Number two, they're used to process people's emotions, such that they begin to forget about why they were upset in the first place. Number three, they're used to delegitimize uprisings. Number four, they're historically underfunded, and the resources or report that they make is usually something you could have done on day one, because it usually just encompasses what was already in the research. And so we set out to say this has to be different. It has to engage the voices of real people all over the entire community. Our meetings will never happen behind closed doors. So if you go to sdlpositivechange.org, you'll find transcripts from all of our public meetings, and you'll find notes from any of our breakout work group meetings. And you'll find that the work of the commission is the work of 3,000 citizens engaged over the process of 10 months and having mobilized about 30,000 volunteer hours. And so that required different kinds of supports. It required a tendency to listen to voices who were directly affected. It required, quite frankly, keeping credibility with voices on the ground from the uprising. And it required some negotiation for the sake of accountability with people who would have to own this report and carry it forward going forward. So what we found ultimately in the product is the affirmation of some things that we know from research on economic mobility from Ross Chetty and others, some things that we know from the ground, from the fast food workers who were fighting for a $15 minimum wage in the Show Me 15 campaign. But all of them had voice in the process and equal voice to get to equity in the product.
Wow. Thank So it sounds like you really charted a different course for this commission and took that different course. You mentioned some negotiations. Would you maybe just talk a little bit about what were some of the toughest negotiations you had to go through to navigate charting a very different course for this commission?
Yeah, so the first negotiation was happening October, I think actually Tashara and I together, October, November for a Child Wellbeing Symposium at the Federal Reserve Bank. I had to step out of the session a couple of times. The commission had not been announced. But the first negotiation was a negotiation for myself and my co-chair with the governor's office to say, if we're going to do this and put our names on it, you got to fund it. And you got to fund it for real. We can't be 3 months down the road trying to figure out how to get enough money to make this thing happen. So it was to say, we need $1 million, you got to find it, and we got to know where it is day one. So it's effectively a state bureaucracy. It needed to be there in order for us to do the work. And we also needed some freedom, so we raised some dollars through foundations, our own Missouri Foundation for Health, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, to be complementary and to be more flexible. We also got some corporate commitments, not as many dollars as it is just capital from folks, human capital from folks. So that was tough. The other critical negotiation was with grassroots organizations on the ground. So we started December 1st. It's helpful to remember that around November 24th was the announcement of the No True bill in the Darren Wilson case. So the city was still in full uprising mode. There was the threat of meetings being shut down. And so my presence, Reverend Tracy Blacksman's presence, Brittany Packnett's presence, Rasheen Aldridge's presence, these are commissioners who are also very active in the uprising. And so we needed to continue to be able to be active on the streets. And we needed people on the streets to believe that the work that we were doing was with and for them, not that we were somehow engaged with the establishment and no longer working on behalf of people who are directly affected, who are young, black, and poor. And so part of the negotiation was we still need space on the streets. And yeah, we'll still be out there with you. And if the tear gas comes, we'll take that too. And we had to a couple of times. In order to be able to continue to advance the work.
You mentioned over 100 recommendations that came out of the commission. Would you just maybe mention a couple that are significant that you want to lift up right now?
Yeah, significant in this group, and Tashara's already noted it, commitment around college savings accounts, asset building strategies, but also capacity building programming for CDFIs in our community, making sure that we've got the strength in the institutions who provide the supports and services to actually reach the number of folks that we're trying to reach. Transitions, a focus and a lens on economic mobility in our public policy. Even introduction of the language and embedding it in this document was groundbreaking for a number of folks. Talking about the raising of the minimum wage, a commitment to a $15 minimum wage in the state as an income strategy. All of these were critical, but we also had to note things like an assessment of transportation. And considering the demographic trends of our community, we recognized that there was growth in jobs in the central corridor, less in the north, less in the south, and there was also, we're also a hyper-segregated community, so in order to get to economic mobility and economic opportunity, we had to run public transportation lines that connected from north to south in order to get people from where the jobs are to where people live, particularly people who need the jobs themselves.
So just with our last couple minutes before we open for Q&A, and I hope people are looking at your ALC app and starting to think about questions you could submit, I want to just turn and really ask you to address our field here. There are 2,000 organizations, nonprofits, and folks from other sectors that are doing asset building that are part of the Asset and Opportunity Network, the Taxpayer Opportunity Network, our other networks. And we can talk about flashpoints where, an episode, a police shooting is caught on tape. I think we all know that what's different right now is that they're being recorded, they're being illuminated, a reality is coming to light which has long existed. And so if we accept that all of our communities are struggling with these same issues, I wonder if you could talk about the range of responses you saw from nonprofit organizations, and any advice that you might have or thoughts for organizations in our field of how to respond, how to react, and also how to be proactive.
Yeah. So I think it's helpful to note, I mean, we're in the midst of, a lot of folks in the context of the grassroots organizing movement had this language early on post-Ferguson about, is this a moment or is this a movement? Are these flashpoints, or is this a flash and turning point in American history? Would be the question that I would frame. I would suggest that once you've had uprisings in Charlotte, in Cincinnati, in St. Louis, in Cleveland, in Charleston, and all of the, we are in the midst of an American turning point if we allow it to be. And so I think about the range of responses that we saw in Ferguson along a number of lines. There were folks, particularly in the economic development, mobility, and asset building space, who thought that it was just about them, people who thought that it wasn't about them at all, and the people who were so slow to the game that they never really made it to play. So the folks who thought it was just about them, before there was a commission, there was a redevelopment plan for the location where Michael Brown was shot. There were for-profit developers who already had a nonprofit strategy that they would financially benefit from as it relates to this uprising and the tragedy of this young man whose name they could seldom call. So it's important to note that in the capitalistic culture, everybody has a way to make money off of everything, including other people's blood and tears. And so what is important to note is that as those interests are moving, CDFIs needed to be moving. I'm very glad that I was connected early on with a local representative of a large nonprofit, of a large foundation that was focused on economic mobility, because it helped me to reframe early to be thoughtful as much about the economic issues as I was about the criminal justice issues in launching into the commission's work. And so I think for the asset building organizations that understood, number one, that this was about them as well, because they are part of a community, right? This is not about black people in the community. This is not about policing in the community. It's about the community's resolve and networks to care for one another. And asset builders are a part of that, right? So once you understand yourself to be a part of that community, then you say that these tables and these conversations are a place that I belong and that I must be in order to effectively do my work. That I don't get to be siloed or get to be sectored aside, but actually I have to be here and be a part of the conversation. And those who responded to say, this is a part of our work, were active in our work group on economic inequality. They were putting forth not only scholarship, but also presenting data in our public meetings, and they were negotiating to say what we actually needed in our community, which included a transformation of philanthropy, quite frankly. I'm helped, and I say this finally as a foundation representative, we were helped in that space to hear people who do asset building work to say around the economic mobility table, that some of the programs that you're funding don't work. That it doesn't help to put a black boy in a tie and take a picture with him about a jobs program if you didn't help him open up a checking account, teach him how to do direct deposit, and engage him in financial literacy. And so it helped to say, we shouldn't fund at the state level, and foundations shouldn't fund programs that don't actually have these basic financial literacy and economic asset building approaches with them, and that perhaps they should also be tied to an IDA strategy. So to hear asset building organizations say that helped to inform, get us smarter in our philanthropy, and hopefully ultimately smarter in our government supported programs as well around workforce development.
Thank you. So I want to just underscore that I heard you talking about the importance of us as asset building organizations continuing to do our critical work and bring our voices to those tables, but also the element of not being late to those tables, being able to get to those tables to play a role, to play a proper role is really, really critical. Yeah. I want to invite Secretary Tashara Jones back up to the stage for our Q&A now. We've got a couple of minutes for Q&A. And those of you who know me know that tech is mostly lost on me. I was trained to use this app here to get questions. And there are a bunch of them here. So this might actually work. I can see them. I'm going to convey them. Hello. So, but I want to start with this first one that I see here for either of you to answer. But how is the coalition dealing with the Department of Justice Evaluation of Police? How has that been addressed?
Yeah, so a couple of things are important to note. The DOJ investigation is on the Ferguson Police Department. So I made the distinction between that hamlet of 30,000 people versus the 2.8 million people. And so the consent decree is in place, there's a monitor in place. There was a group called the Ferguson Collaborative that helped to inform it. The commission itself was engaged with the DOJ as well. So we believe that we got to a good document. Quite frankly, part of what we need is the application of the DOJ principles to all of our police departments. We have 57 police departments in the metropolitan area. Transforming one of them is fine, but ultimately we need to transform policing generally. So actually, I would suggest that if we can get, I would suggest that if we can get full implementation on a bill, Senate Bill 5 that we got passed in the Missouri legislature, that actually for the first time called for the certification of police departments in our state, then actually we go further than even DOJ. I think the impact of DOJ, quite frankly, is going to be that 10 years from now there won't be a Ferguson Police Department. There will be some other conglomeration that polices different regions of St. Louis. But let us be clear. DOJ has been proven in Seattle, it's been proven in Cincinnati. Wherever you live, if DOJ comes in, they'll have the same findings as the ones in Ferguson. The exact same findings. The question is, what's going to happen? And that is a community question. Implementation and oversight is a community question because DOJ is investigating how many places right now? And we got the same issues. And so this is about us owning this reality, not the Department of Justice.
Thank you. Next question I see here. How is wealth stripping being addressed by the commission? For example, exorbitant traffic and other fines and fees.
Yeah, so there's several things here. We found that so actually municipal fees is a critical matter of wealth stripping that's happening in St. Louis metropolitan community. There was a report that came out from ProPublica after the commission's work. We were in conversation with them, but it came out after that actually identifies St. Louis, North County, Jennings, one of the other municipalities neighboring Ferguson, is one of the leaders in wealth stripping through municipal fees. We see it in our municipal courts where people were getting fines on top of fines for things like failures to appear. So the same violation could have you get multiple tickets, and ultimately this becomes an aversion to ever going to court because you couldn't pay the first one, much less pay these 3 that you got for the first one. So one of the things that we've been working with the municipal courts to do in the Supreme Court and their oversight responsibility is to set new standards for the courts, because ultimately this is what's happening in many cities, but definitely in ours, that our courts are being used as ATMs for a system of fragmentation that is paid for by policing It turns police into armed collection agents and turns young black and poor people into targets. So in our section on criminal justice, we talk about municipal court reform, including calling for the consolidation of courts so that these courts that are larger do not have a responsibility to local municipalities to fund them, but rather have the responsibility of caring for public safety and equity.
One more point I'd like to add is within our municipal court system is a serious defragmentation problem. There are 81 municipal courts for an area of 1.2 million people. And the other problem with the failure to appear and the warrants, it makes people ineligible to get a job. It also, and it's a series or a domino effect of being involved with the municipal court system that they can't get out of. So again, the recommendations, if we all take them seriously, because we need leadership at the top to take these recommendations seriously as we are looking towards new elections coming up in November and March of next year. If we don't have leadership at the top to take these recommendations seriously, we'll just have another report that sits on a shelf.
I want to ask, or one of our participants wants to ask, how did you deal with the other kind of response, the kind of law and order response to the protests, to what happened? How did you navigate that kind of pushback, that alternative response of we just need more law and order and tamping down on everybody?
Yeah, it's going to take creative coalitions. First of all, folks need to know ain't nobody going nowhere. I'm sorry, that wasn't the King's English. We here. So folks are going to be in the streets of Charlotte, folks are going to be in the streets in Detroit, in DC, folks are going to be occupying spaces in Los Angeles and New York until there is change. Ain't nobody going nowhere, right? And so that's part of it. You respond to in your face with in your face. People miss this. I'm a pastor, sorry. People miss this turn the other cheek metaphor in the scriptures as if it is, somebody slaps you on this side, you give them the other side, so this meek and mild response. No, actually turning one's face to an opponent is an offense. It is a challenge to invite them to try to do it again. And so part of the response is to sustain presence in the streets. Part of the response is to amplify the voices of those in the streets from places of power. One of the most powerful things that happened was the CEOs of a collaboration of foundations from across the country called the Executives Alliance for Expanding Opportunities for Boys and Young Men of Color, say that 3 times fast, took out full-page ads in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and the New York Times, and Washington, D.C., and the Washington Post, calling on the local officials in St. Louis to listen to the demands of the protesters. So what does it mean to use our spaces and our places of privilege, to use our platforms in philanthropy to push on government in order to give cover to grassroots organizing to sustain accountability? These are the kinds of things that will be continually required in order to advance this kind of agenda.
Thank you. Okay. There are a lot of financial institutions here as sponsors, yet any analysis of racial inequity also involves an analysis of the practices of financial institutions. Just like we have a message here for our members of how do we change our practices, is there a message in here for financial institutions to also change their practices?
I take a point of privilege here. I think we have to re-envision and rethink CRA. I think we need to be, we've got to be intentional. Thank you. I think we've got to be intentional. One of our one of the national banks that has a significant community development corporation presence in St. Louis, which I won't name because I don't know if they're a sponsor or not, has been taking all of their 300 CDC employees through racial equity training in small groups, including other members of the community as well. So what does it mean to take it so seriously that the CEO sits in on every session? What does it mean to take it so seriously that every employee has to go through racial equity training? What does it mean to make sure that that informs your policy? That's one thing. The other thing is to recognize this is that and that is this. So I can't leave the last 10 seconds without saying the Vision for Black Lives policy platform also calls for divestment and investment And it also suggests that there are implications for where we keep our assets. And if we keep our assets in places of oppression overseas, then we can't expect to get to racial equity in the US. And so I own this. I'm working right now on strengthening the socially responsible investment policy at Deaconess Foundation. The hardest fight I have right now is aligning our investment policy with the BDS movement. But it is wholly aligned with our faith commitments and with our justice commitments. And we can't believe that we're going to oppress, that we're going to segregate, that we're going to dominate people in one space and free people in another space based upon our charitable dollars or our commitments to CRA.
Thank you.
So the last point I'd like to add, I know we're a little over time. The last point I'd like to add is that as treasurer, I feel like it's my responsibility to hold banks accountable to their CRA provisions. And I have done so in the last 3 years that I've had this job. We've seen more banks and financial institutions and credit unions involved in local activities through my office than we've seen historically through my predecessor's term, which lasted 31 years. So we never start a project in our office without finding a private partner in a financial institution or a credit union, because we know that these partnerships work and we explore them as much as we can.
Thank you. Thank you. I think this work that we have ahead of us has such potential for actually getting to the society that we want to live in, and it requires all of us, every sector and every organization, to be open to being transformed and transforming our practices. I really appreciate this conversation for helping us to take another step on that walk. I want to call Lee Tivell back up to the stage. Thank you so much. Thanks.